Justify. Prove to be right or reasonable. Justification is at the heart of all legal and political argument. But at a time when argument itself is slave to appearances, it is time to bring back a culture of justification. Justify, a podcast on law and politics in India from the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, hosted by Arghya Sengupta.
Welcome to season 3 of Justify, and thank you very much for tuning in again. We are back after a slightly longer break than we would have liked, thanks to the third wave. But I hope you and all your families are well. And now we are back to hold a series of addas on critical legal and policy issues of the day. And this year, since we are doing it right in the aftermath of some very eventful state elections, we are going to be discussing legal issues from Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, and Goa, not all of which made the electoral cut. So let's dive straight in to season 3 of Justify. State elections have always been scrappy battles in India, usually pitting a commanding regional party against a more well-organized and older national party. It's now established wisdom that people vote very differently for their chief minister than they would for the prime minister. But is it personality alone that drives elections, apart from, of course, the traditional cocktail of caste and clan? What about the key development and social issues in the state that matter? And surely for a democracy where governments are voted in to pass laws that would make lives of citizens easier, surely the lawmaking record of state governments should also matter, maybe a little bit. Punjab went to the polls on the 20th of February this year. It promises to be a three-way contest with the incumbent Congress, the resurgent AAP, and a newly minted captain with the BJP as the 12th man. So what did captain and the Congress do in its last 5 years when it comes to major legislation? Let's have a look. It passed 36 acts which are now in effect. Many notable laws have been passed to ensure ease of living of citizens as well as ease of doing business. Its actual implementation record, though, is still unknown. This is not a comment that they have not implemented it. It's just that we don't know what's happening. So some examples: the Punjab Transparency and Accountability in Delivery of Public Service Act and Transparency in Public Procurement Act both look at providing better public services through processes that have integrity. Then there is the rather interesting, the Punjab Right to Business Act. It almost sounds libertarian, to provide for ease of doing business for micro, small and medium enterprises in the state of Punjab, setting up self-declaration mechanisms, speedier clearances, exemptions, particularly from inspections, to operate in the state of Punjab. There's also the rather interestingly named the Punjab Anti-Red Tape Act 2021 to eliminate red tape and promote effective administration, particularly in G2B and G2C services. Now, that's actually a range of very interesting legislation, but not everything is unicorns and rainbows. In 2017, in a dramatic speech, Captain Amrinder Singh had declared, and I quote, "I will break the backbone of drug addiction in 4 weeks," unquote. Not only has the backbone not been broken, it seems to have developed a spine in the last 5 years. A study by the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy in 2018 had shown that Punjab continuously recorded the highest number of cases anywhere in India under the NDPS Act, the legislation that criminalizes drug use and trafficking. The number was as high as 42.3% of all cases in India in 2013 came from Punjab. So that basically means 4 out of every 10 drug cases in India were in Punjab. This, as the study showed, was wiping out a full generation of young Punjabis, because 71.4% of persons who were convicted were in the 20 to 40 age group. So that was like a real generation being wiped out because of the drug problem. There were also very few rehabilitation centers to rehabilitate these addicts. Moga district, which had 625 cases, had no government centers and a handful of private facilities. And several other districts like Pathankot hasn't had 10 government centers, no private facilities. Amritsar did better, it had 60 centers, but it also had some 2,400 odd cases. So it's a large number of cases. Clearly the demand for rehabilitation centers far exceeded the supply. It's no surprise that a 2022 study by PGI showed that over 3 million people, amounting to 15.4% of the population in Punjab, are consuming some kind of drug. So to tackle this issue, the state government has been flirting with the idea of several legislations, including the CARDA, the Comprehensive Action Against Drug Abuse. It is aimed to set up a holistic program for de-addiction. But with the internal political upheaval in the state, these bills have taken the back seat. Will they come back? And how does the NDPS Act operate on the ground in Punjab? Is it time to replace it with a law that is more effective and treats addicts as addicts and not as convicts? To discuss these issues today, we have Animesh Sharma, a leading lawyer practicing before the Punjab and Haryana High Court and a close friend, and Neha Singhal, who's the lead of the criminal justice team at Vidhi and one of India's foremost experts on drug regulation, who has also authored the study, another close friend. So it's between three friends today. Thanks very much, Animesh and Neha, for joining me today.
Good evening.
Very good to be here. Thank
Hi,
you.
Neha.
Hi,
Great.
Animesh.
So, Neha, I'm going to start with you since you did this first study on the drug situation in Punjab. 5 years after Amrinder Singh's grand statement that he's going to break the backbone of drugs in Punjab, Punjab is still finding it a struggle to end the drug menace. And even this year, in the run-up to the elections, we've heard a lot of stories about drugs, particularly with Bikram Singh Majithia being caught in a drugs case. Why are drugs so wildly popular in Punjab?
Punjab is a unique state in its geographical position, where it is placed geographically. It being a border state from Pakistan, and it's a route of heroin into India. Drugs come from Afghanistan. Heroin comes from Afghanistan to Pakistan, to Amritsar, Taran, Gurdaspur, etc. These border districts. So drugs are very easily available. Heroin is very easily available in these border districts for that reason. It also shares a border with Rajasthan, which makes opium very easily available. It also shares a border with Himachal, which makes cannabis easily available. So it shares a border with 3 drug transporting or producing states, which makes it geographically prime for drug consumption. Also, post the Green Revolution, where Punjab prospered as a state, it has also seen a decline in industrialization. The youth is largely unemployed. They don't wish to work in the state itself. They wish to leave the country and work wherever else, but they don't wish to work while they're in the state. So that means there's a large population of unemployed but well-to-do youth, and they resort to drug use. The drug use, though, hasn't stayed in well-to-do populations. It has trickled down to everybody, and I think now it has become such a habit, and because it is so widely used, it is so widely available, that even between peers, between people, there are people of school-going people, college-going people, find it very easy to access drugs. So it has just become a rampant epidemic in the state.
So Animesh, tell us, you live in Chandigarh, you practice in the Punjab and Haryana High Court. Neha just painted this very bleak picture about drugs in Punjab. And this is exactly what the NDPS Act was supposed to curb, as in with heavy penalties to ensure deterrence, not only for traffickers, but also for small use and consumers. So what's going wrong? As in, is the act failing?
So I'll tell you what is happening in the courts, for example. The pendency of NDPS cases in the Punjab and Haryana High Court in the last several years has just increased many folds. In fact, there was a recent judgment out in 2022, Bhupinder Singh versus NCB, in which the High Court was talking about how suspension of sentence, which is essentially bail after conviction, should work in NDPS cases, and looking at it from the point of view of Article 21. And the case looked at cases that are pending in the High Court from 2013 to 2021, and the figures are quite staggering. So if you see from 2013 to 2021, the number of cases which were pending before the division benches of the Punjab and Haryana High Court, the High Court only decided in 9 years from 2013 to 21 a total of 129 cases. That is the DBs. That is essentially less than 14 cases a year. And the single benches, in which the quantity of drug is perhaps smaller, the total number of cases that were decided were 1,925 cases. Whereas in the same time, the number of cases that were filed before the division benches were about 1,080 cases. And before the single benches, the number of cases that were filed were 14,827.
So 14,800 filed and only 1900 disposed of. So
Yes,
that's
so
like
approximately, yes. Yes, so about approximately 16,000
12,000. So
cases
that's
filed.
1,000 cases a year that's getting added on.
1,000 cases in a year that's added on. So certainly, as far as the pendency of NDPS cases is concerned in courts, it is only increasing. And as far as what also happens in courts in NDPS cases is that when people approach the courts for bails, especially in cases where quantity is commercial quantity, which is as defined in the Act, a higher level of quantity, in most cases, the chances of getting bail are almost nil, because the High Court will not grant not grant bail, and there's essentially a bar in the Act as well to grant bail, and then the cases are also not being decided because appeals are pending for several years. So as a result, the number of under trials as well as people who are convicted and whose appeals are pending in courts keeps increasing over the last several years.
So this Animesh is a familiar story, right? As in, you take any legislation in India and you see that there is significant degrees of delay and pendency for most legislation. Okay, and for particularly for poorer clients and victims, delays are an endemic feature. But it would seem to me, from the perspective of a potential drug user, that the fact that I will be caught in a justice system that is so slow means that my life is going to be essentially ruined. So in some sense, a slow justice system could also very counterintuitively be a bigger deterrent, right? Because you know that you can't get out of this. Once you're trapped, you're trapped.
Although you speak of users, Animesh is speaking of traffickers. He's talking about commercial quantities of drugs. Now, the Act assumes that if you're a user, you're not going to be caught with a commercial quantity of drugs. And the Act does make it possible for you to exit the criminal justice system much faster than that. The reason why it is so onerous, where there is no suspension of sentence or no remission of sentence in the Act, is this is only for commercial quantity of drugs, right? It is meant to be.
I'm going to interrupt you.
Commercial or
something is moving, your mic or something.
All right, here. I will.
I want to make this khush sound, which will be a problem for me.
Okay. I think if I stay still, it will be better. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So should I repeat?
Yeah, just start wherever. Just repeat that bit so that they'll cut out the previous.
All right. So I just wanted to point out that when you were talking about the slow justice delivery system, and what Animesh was referring to, he was referring to commercial quantity of drugs. The user is likely to be caught with small quantity of drugs. That's what the law assumes in any case. It is making a distinction between a user and a trafficker, and the suspension of sentence that Animesh spoke of, or remission of sentence. This is not allowed for people caught with commercial quantities of drugs. This will not apply to a user. And as I would understand, users are not likely to be the ones filing for bail or filing appeals in high courts. These are likely to be people caught with commercial quantities. So traffickers or peddlers or mules, but not users.
Yes, essentially for bails, as far as bails are concerned, for people who are caught with small quantities or even intermediate or what is known as non-commercial quantities, bails are much easier. Suspension is also much easier than for people who are caught for commercial quantities, because the Act presupposes that no matter what quantity you've been caught with, you are guilty of a crime. But the distinction of small and commercial clearly is for the reason that if you're caught for commercial quantity, then you are considered a trafficker. And then in that situation, the Act will certainly preclude. The Act also makes it much harder for you to get bail. And
so let's take these two separately, of users and traffickers. Okay, so let's start with users, because one of the reasons as to why Punjab is such a unique case is because of the large percentage of its population, as in which seems to be on the basis of data, consuming drugs. Okay, so let's take the users first. Neha, in your research in Punjab, where did you find the NDPS Act failing? Because we can clearly say that the Act is failing because it is an inadequate deterrent preventing people from using drugs. Because the thought was that make it a crime, and so people will not do it. But people are still doing it, and they're doing it more and more. So where is the Act failing in Punjab?
I think the Act in its conceptualization is a failed attempt, so it is going to fail at every juncture. Just the idea that one can deter drug use is a fail. It's a problematic thought, because one can't. Anybody who wants to experiment in drug use will. What if one had to do this seriously? One would just have to curb supply, which I don't think the NDPS Act has been able to do in any part of the country. Forget just.
So let's keep the supply and the trafficking stuff aside for a moment. So as far as use, you're saying that if someone wants to experiment with drug use, they'll do it anyway, irrespective of
regardless.
Right. So is it your point that the NDPS Act then is failing in the whole country? It just seems like it's failing more in Punjab because more people are using it in Punjab, but it's failing in the whole country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is failing in the entire country. There is no doubt about it, because the act, as I said, in its conceptualization itself fails. When it looks at drug consumption as an offense, that itself is it's a flawed concept. It's a flawed idea. So it is likely to fail.
Like the jurisprudential question here would be then, how much should the state go? How much should interfere in criminalizing vices, right? Like, it's like a vice. So
yes,
whereas trafficking is not just a vice, it's a organized criminal activity. Correct. But for somebody who's just using it, it's essentially a vice. Like alcoholism, for example. Tomorrow you can criminalize alcoholism in the country, and Punjab would probably be very high up in alcoholism as well.
Absolutely.
But
so if we want to, so let's take that argument. So one way we can think about it is this kind of leveling down, which is that you make alcoholism also an offense because it's a vice, you make cigarette smoking an offense because it's a vice, and you keep legislating along those lines. Or you could take the other approach, which is to say that you allowed alcohol, you allowed cigarette, all of which with great safeguards. So you allow consumption of drugs, because at the end of the day, it is not other regarding, you're doing it to yourself, you're harming your own body. And there's no reason as to why the state should intervene, as long as it remains self-regarding. So Neha, what is your sense? Would that be
this is definitely, this is what I am an advocate of, decriminalizing any kind of drug use, any at all, because it is an indulgence. It is something a person, probably if it was decriminalized, if we had safe places, if we had better regulations, people would do it in a more safe manner. Right now, people experiment with drugs not knowing what their consequences can be, what are safer drugs to use, what are harder drugs to use, what safe environments a person should be using them in, which just means that more people are putting themselves in harm's way than they would if this was a regulated market. Not just that, drugs are highly adulterated. A lot of times, this emerged from Punjab research as well as Bombay research in Maharashtra, is that people end up getting addicted to substances that they didn't even know existed. Like if there is a bag of weed which is going to be adulterated with shoe polish or with benzodiazepines, anything else, any other substance, it's possible that a person might form addiction to the substance that they didn't even know they were consuming. So this happens because we are in this prohibition world where everything is prohibited. There is no regulation in the market. So if we had a more regulated, more supervised way of consuming drugs, we might have a safer environment for the user.
But of course, as in to a non-sympathetic mind, as in this would seem like a heretic suggestion, right? Like you're saying that just because you can't control something, you legalize it, right? So now, and there, it seems to me to be interesting that the NDPS Act also has provisions to move small users into de-addiction. So it's not as if the NDPS Act does not envisage what you're saying. It does, of course, it may call it a crime, but the fact is that it envisages that the place for an addict is in a rehabilitation home or a de-addiction center. Now, to either of you, why does it then seem that these provisions are not being used? And why is it that the facilities, as Neha, your study in Punjab showed, as in are woeful in comparison to the numbers in the population that are affected by the drug?
Animesh, why don't you take this, given that you're in the state, and I'll answer later.
I think, yes. So one reason I think for provisions like treating users as addicts and sending them to de-addiction centers are concerned, it's just perhaps a lack of knowledge about these provisions at different levels. The act is taken to be a very stringent act. So if the approach of a judge is that because you've been caught under this act, you're automatically a criminal, the judge is then going to view you from that standpoint.
And do you get to see that a lot in your NDPS cases that you do?
Yes, yes,
certainly. This is an NDPS case, this is a drug crime.
I have never, even at the level of the High Court, where judges are supposed to be more knowledgeable and erudite, and they've dealt with several of these cases. I have never seen any judge ever send a person to a de-addiction center.
Yes,
that's a big claim.
That's never
That's a big
happened.
claim.
I've never seen it.
In your what now, 14 years of
yes,
practice.
I've never seen that happen. So nobody really looks at it as an act that is meant to treat addicts and treat them separately from
correct.
traffickers. The approach is that because you've been caught in this act, you're automatically a criminal. The act does not have, in fact, because the act does not require mens rea, the mere possession is a crime and not active known possession. So therefore you're a criminal, and the act then treats you like that. And that's how the judges treat you as well then. So that's certainly one reason why users are also criminalized under the act, and then the act fails in that regard. And also, as far as the question is of not criminalizing something just because there is rampant use, Shivratri just passed here and all across Haryana, because it's in Punjab, because it's a big Hindu festival. You see ascetics who are constantly on cannabis
consumption,
drugs, and it's absolutely normal. It's in fact regular people who are from the not the very rich people, but ordinary people will consider this as something which must be done on a cannabis.
Because at the end of the day, Shivji himself was
doing
it.
So the drug is, of course, I mean, it's because here it's an accepted practice.
Part of our culture.
It's a society. Yeah, the society accepts it. That's very normal. So people. So I have there. You have stalls on the roads of people selling pakoras that are made out of
Bhang,
cannabis,
right?
or bhang. Yeah. So that it's absolutely normal. It's the society.
So how does that happen? Bhang, is that bhang exempted from the act?
Yes, it is.
The curiosity, it's exempted.
Bhang is, yeah. In the definition of cannabis, there is an exception created for bhang, for the leaves, I think, the way the section has been defined.
Okay, so Animesh is saying something very interesting, because the fact is that there is this impression that is created that this NDP is a draconian legislation, it is tough on crime, and so you must be stringent. So Neha, given the fact that these provisions exist for moving to de-addiction, what in your sense is preventing
I think so. Animesh touched upon something very relevant. This law is meant to be deterrent. It is meant to be focused on penalties and penalizing people. The one section that deals with de-addiction, which creates a provision for de-addiction centers, Section 71 of the Act, the section starts with the word may. It doesn't have a shall. The state governments are not required to create centers. They may create them, but the government is certainly, and the police is certainly required to arrest people they find using drugs. Judges have because there is a mandatory minimum for commercial quantities of drugs. Judges don't have the discretion to award people lower sentences, even if they think these people are meriting of lower sentences. So there are a lot of mandates in the law, but there is no mandate when it comes to de-addiction centers. And the states have taken the lack of mandate seriously. They have not bothered to create centers. And de-addiction, especially in a state like Punjab, de-addiction centers are a great way of making money. So there are a lot of centers, private centers, which charge anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20,000 rupees a day. They provide suboptimal services because the service providers
are unregulated. They're largely unregulated.
They're largely unregulated. They are. I think Punjab is coming out with rules now around de-addiction centers. But from the research that we did at that time, these were unregulated centers. There was a lot of abuse happening in these centers because obviously addicts are not easy to deal with, and you don't have properly trained service providers. So it's the lack of focus on de-addiction rehabilitation in the law, in the state's imagination, which is leading to an actual impact on the ground where it's just not taken seriously.
Yeah, and I think that's both of you are making a very valid point, that even the imagination of those who are working the law, whether it be the policemen, policewomen, and the judges, as in this person in front of you is a criminal, then the person will be dealt with as a criminal and not be shown any leniency or sympathy. Whereas, as your research shows, Neha, the person is just like a patient, as in he or she is an addict. They need help.
They need help.
They need rehabilitation. And obviously, and this is, I'm assuming, just commonsensically, if they're going to be put in prison with 100 other addicts, then that addiction is only going to get worse because they're not going to get treated.
I just want to add a little bit to this, that I think from what I've spoken to judges, Animesh largely deals with high court judges. So at least the trial court judges, magistrates, sessions court judges do see, when they see an addict in front of them, it's actually very hard to be stone cold around them because you're seeing misery. play out in front of you. But a lot of times these judges don't have the discretion of sending them to de-addiction centers, because the law is very particular in who one can send to de-addiction centers, even if one wanted to. It's going to be anybody caught with small quantities of drugs. Small quantities of drugs are very narrowly defined. A person that has been arrested might not be arrested with just small quantity of drugs, but might still be an addict. But the judge is helpless. They can't do anything about this. What they can do is wherever there is imprisonment or fine available, they might just impose a fine on them and not send them to prison.
And
That's
that
the
is
best.
only when the matter gets to trial.
That's only when the matter gets to trial. He could have been under trial all this while, but that's the most kindness the judge can extend, even if they wanted to the addict. So we're creating a situation which is right for unkindness. Kindness just doesn't exist within the system. We haven't created a system in which kindness could be possible.
But Animesh, does this mean that if the point that you made about pendency, just flowing from that, does it mean that the key stage in courts regarding the NDPS Act is the stage of bail? Because trial is going to take a long time, or even in appeal, the actual hearing of the appeal is going to take a long time. So it's really everything coming down to bail, which is a question of discretion. And because this person is seen as a criminal, the discretion is inevitably exercised not in their favor.
So bail is certainly important as far as small quantities are concerned, or even intermediate quantities are concerned. For those cases, bails are not very difficult to get. Small quantities, courts will certainly grant bail. But as far as commercial quantities is concerned, it's very, very hard to get bail, because the supposition is that you are a trafficker of drugs. And in that case, even in that case, because appeals take years, in most cases decades to be decided, and the guidelines that are now laid down are that if you spent a minimum number of years inside prison, because your appeal is not likely to be heard in the next several years, you are entitled to get bail. So even for a trafficker, then from the other point of view, a trafficker will possibly want to get bail out, because even his appeal is not going to be decided in the next several years. So then if you're out on bail becomes a very important
aspect of
yeah, so I think this is something that's commonly emerging from all work around the judicial system, that it's a system that's broken. And where we are talking about things like giving someone bail because their appeal is not likely to be heard. Okay, so, and these are all situations where we are trying to deal with a broken system by applying some band-aids in particular cases, and which is why actually the people just don't have faith in the justice system. And that works both ways. As in, one is that people continue to do whatever they want to, as if the law didn't exist. And on the other side, sometimes people, as we have seen with kinds of vigilante justice that have been on the rise, people do take the law into their own hands, and people support other people taking law into their own hands, like the encounter killing of those 4 alleged rapists of the girl in Hyderabad. And there was a widespread celebration in the country. But I'm digressing. If coming back to this point about Punjab, let's look at what the Punjab government has done in the last 5 years, particularly staying with the theme of users. So a few initiatives have been taken by the government. There is the Buddy program, which is based on early identification of potential users through peers. There is a drug abuse prevention officers program based on knowledge dissemination, identification of users, at-risk sections, providing them with support. So the Punjab government does seem to be doing something. There was also the CADA bill, which is a comprehensive bill that deals with drugs as a public health issue rather than a criminal issue or the usage of drugs. So Neha, what do you think of these measures that seek to prevent addiction as a policy response in tandem with the operation of the NDPS Act, which criminalizes drug addiction?
NDPS is a central act. It criminalizes addiction, and there is states wherever they are trying to fight addiction or trying to be kinder to users, they're trying to do it with whatever ad hoc measures they can adopt for the state. The Buddy program is largely exists in schools where a child or a student is assigned the role of a buddy, and he is supposed to identify or look out for early signs of addiction amongst his classmates. DAPO is a community program, again, meant for encouraging people to choose de-addiction services. Punjab has been very proud of both of these programs, and they talk about how many buddy programs they have started and how many buddies they have enlisted and how many DAPOs they have enlisted. This is both, this is also a volunteer program, as DAPO is also a volunteer program, and they're very proud of how many people they have on it. But it hasn't been very effective. They're using these numbers to say that they are very enthusiastic, but there is very little in terms of consequence, because one, drugs continue to be very easily available. Two, drugs continue to be criminalized. What research told me was that in a lot of these pop-up de-addiction centers, when the police is hard-pressed to get arrests, they just hang around these de-addiction centers and they arrest people en masse. Right, like they arrest people en masse around the de-addiction centers because they need to get their numbers high. So these are also places, despite these provisions existing, as long as there is criminalization in the law, as long as there is police that can pick up people at any given time for drug use, and when there are these centers and they know that there are going to be addicts around these centers and these addicts can fill up jail numbers, it's easy to show arrests. These programs are going to do nothing because the police still has the power it has to criminalize and to arrest.
Ultimately, I think what you're pointing to is that, and which is a kind of running theme through this conversation, is that we need to change mindsets. And we need to change mindsets because until and unless mindsets change, the law will not change. And if the law doesn't change, then the buddy program, despite the best of intentions, will only go that far. So Animesh, since you're on the ground in Punjab, you see these cases on a regular basis, you handle some of them. In your view, is the NDPS Act working, or should we look at alternative legislative frameworks, not just executive programs like the buddy program?
I think, as Neha said, the NDPS Act, as far as drug users are concerned, it is not working because the approach is certainly not right. As far as drug trafficking is concerned, I think the provisions are stringent. In fact, the Act also has provisions like the death penalty for repeat offenders. But as far as trafficking is concerned, the reason why it is not working perhaps is, in Punjab at least, there's also a sense that the entire system is not really trying to prevent trafficking, because the sense is that politicians are involved, sense is police is certainly involved. They are, for example, as you just started off, Mr. there's an FIR against Mr. Majitia. There was an FIR recently against Mr. Khera, who is another prominent politician. Jagdish Singh Bhola, who was an international wrestler and politician and DSP, was convicted under the NDPS Act a few years ago. So there's certainly a sense that the entire system is not really trying to prevent trafficking. They do catch traffickers, but on the ground, people who are suffering from the problem, families who are suffering from the problem, also feel that the real kingpins are not being caught. So yes, from the point of trafficking, there is, and of course, as we looked at the pendency of cases, that shows that really the cases are pending for several years and not being decided. So yes, there is certainly failure of the NDPS Act on both fronts, on criminalizing users as far as small quantity is concerned, and as far as trafficking is concerned, not being effective enough. One of the things that the Punjab government had also tried to do recently, I think last year, was they had tried to incentivize information. Rewards were introduced for people who were giving information, and rewards were based on the amount of drugs that were then subsequently caught or recovered. But it hasn't really translated, I think, to real results on the grounds, and which is also why in every election, and certainly in this election, NDPS is a big issue. It's a huge issue. Every government, every political party comes and says that their main aim and one of the main agendas of the next government will be to eradicate NDPS from the state.
Eradicate NDPS Act from the state.
Not the act, eradicate
drug use.
Yes, drug
yeah
use.
So I think that actually is an interesting point, because of course it came into the public imagination as in through Udta Punjab, as in with
Yeah.
no disrespect to Neha's study, which was great, but I think Udta Punjab was a bit
Did
more
the trick.
accessible
Yeah.
than Neha's study. But the point is that, of course, as I see, even in the run-up to these polls, every political party makes the same claim. Amrinder Singh made this claim in 2017, saying that he would break the backbone of drugs. It doesn't happen because it seems like there is no plan as to how it can happen. And so, Neha, we've discussed that what we need to do with users is quite clear. That we need to send them to de-addiction centers. We have to invest in de-addiction centers and make sure that these people are treated. But what do we do with traffickers? Is the NDPS Act good enough, or do you think that some reform is necessary there as well?
The law, there is no legislative reform that will help. What Animesh said, what you spoke of, Majithia, prominent other states people who have been caught or who have been at least accused of being traffickers. If you're going to have people in the state government or people who are prominent, who have prominent positions in the government, being traffickers, you know that there is no actual political will, there is no state will to curb trafficking. So you can make a law as stringent or as well thought out as you'd like, but if there is no will to execute the law, there is very little one can do. In addition, while Animesh is speaking, I remember this one incident where some family member of a person who had been arrested for trafficking told me that they actually saw drug peddling and trafficking as a viable employment option. They just didn't have employment opportunities in Punjab. And they said, "Ye kabutarbazi karta, bahar jata, kam se kam, at least jail mein hum inse mil pate hain. They can at least meet him in the jail. He's here, he's right here, he's not left the country and left our lives." So if you're going to be, it's in a state which is grappling with addiction, grappling with unemployment, grappling with people looking at drug trade being a viable means of earning money, and a state which is actively participating in drug trafficking, no law will fix this.
Which is also why I think decriminalizing usage and even perhaps legalizing some level of drug usage will help the state to take control of the entire problem, because you have more information than at your hands, you have more data, people who are using drugs are in your system, you are getting, because you are legalizing usage of some drugs, you are getting more funds to perhaps get better facilities to deal with other serious drugs which are considered to be more dangerous, and you can then set up better facilities. So legalizing some form of drug, as is happening in several countries across the world right now, is a viable option to even deal with the more harder, more serious drugs. And of course, decriminalizing is a first step, and then legalizing is something which the state can consider to even deal with the other larger problems.
Even with trafficking.
Yes.
And particularly with trafficking, because as we've seen,
Yes.
right from the US itself, one of the reasons why trafficking became a multi-billion-dollar industry is because it went underground, right?
Punjab, for example, is another election issue is that Punjab is a bankrupt state. They don't have money because all larger industries are supposed to be again cartelized, right? Mining is cartelized, transport is cartelized, alcohol excise is cartelized. So if the state can legalize some kind of drug use and that can get in some funds, that money can be put to good use to check trafficking.
But Animesh, here's a question for you, and we're close to the end of this conversation. But you said that this is a poll issue, the NDPS Act, eradication of drugs is a major poll issue, because obviously 71.4% of the population is affected in some way or the other, then or whatever, the age group of 21 to 40 is affected, then certainly it has to be a poll issue. But it seems to me that every party seems to be saying the same thing, like we'll eradicate drugs. Okay, and okay, no one can oppose that. But no one can say, I don't want to eradicate drugs. But it seems also that there is a complete dearth of ideas in terms of how to do it. And there doesn't seem to be any difference except making these, macho statements that we will eradicate it. Okay, and given the fact that any charge of any claim that we want to legalize or decriminalize often goes against this view that we want to be tough on crime. Okay, and this is a kind of general stereotype that's there, and it's true in the government of India and in most state governments, that we want to be tough on crime. Okay, and so how do you see this as a real electoral issue, because one, there is no difference between what the various parties are saying. So people can't choose one party over other on what they're saying on drugs.
Yes.
And two is that when it actually comes to decriminalizing or legalizing, it goes against this stereotype that everyone wants to be seen as tough. And if I may use a stereotype, as in Punjabis are seen as definitionally tough. Okay, so how is this actually going to play out?
Yes.
Is decriminalization even
So
a
you're
reality?
right. So certainly when all these political parties are making statements to the effect that they will eradicate the drug problem in Punjab, they're not talking about decriminalizing it, or they're not talking about legalizing. Their idea is that they will use
Send
police
everybody to
force
jail.
and power to stamp down on traffickers. That's what Amrinder also said 5 years ago, that he will eradicate it by arresting more people and just trying to clamp down on the problem. And this is what now the Aam Aadmi Party is also saying. The BJP has also linked it to be with drug coming from Pakistan as a national threat sort of issue as well. So their approach is not legislative or not thinking out of the box, but certainly, as you said, to just use more force and more police force, as well as arresting more people, to show that they have the numbers and therefore try to claim that they've made a difference. And that is not the long-term solution at all. You're not going to eradicate the problem. Nobody can come and can check the entire system in a few months by saying that they've arrested everybody who's concerned, especially if the system is strongly cartelized already, if strong people are already in the system, and that's also one of the reasons.
Happen, and two, even if it did happen, the fact is that it's never a reality, because you can't put 71.4% of your population in prison.
And you're not thinking of solving the problem from the point of view of legalizing some drug users, or decriminalizing users, or trying to find more ways to take addicts out of the system. That's not what the claim really is, because you have to, as you said, you have to sound strong. You have to make it an issue that you will just clamp down on the problem, and that's what these political parties are doing right now.
And the last question is that, do you think that if some political party came out and said that we are going to decriminalize drug usage, at least small usage, how do you think the people of the state, who are obviously affected by this, because every member of some family or the other has some drug related problem, not every member, that may be an overstatement, but many families would have that. How do you think a proposal for decriminalization would be taken?
It may not be as badly received as people think, because traditionally, for example, a lot of the non-synthetic drugs are truck drivers, for example, are traditionally known to use some kind of drugs, because they're going on long drives and they need to be awake. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so they use that regularly. So there are lots of drugs which people consider as a part of as normal
real life, right?
Yeah, real life. So it may not be something which is that adversely received, or something which they'll just shoot because it seems like a soft solution to the problem. So, but people, I don't know if people have tried it as such, but I think it should be something which the state government should consider.
I think this is an idea that we can leave with all political parties which are looking to be innovative, particularly in Punjab, that do try putting decriminalization of some small drugs, at least on your manifesto. All it will mean is that you're not making a promise to put 40 lakh farmers who are using odd amounts of poppy husk, and 30 lakh truck drivers who are taking a little bit of drug because they are
driving all night.
You're just promising that you're not going to put them in prison. Maybe, you know what, it'll help you win more votes than lose some. So we'll have to stop it here. It's been a really engrossing conversation. The results in the elections, we'll see what happens. I don't think drugs is a bellwether issue, because everyone's saying the same things. But I hope that whichever government is elected does take a close, hard look that the current approach of treating an addict as a convict, in Neha's words, has not worked. And we need to treat an addict as an addict, as someone who needs help. Thank you very much, Neha, Animesh, for this really engrossing conversation. And to all your listeners, hope you enjoyed this and look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye. It's time for this week's Clatter question, our legal quiz, which is slightly harder than CLAT. So here goes. What is the connection between Section 54 of the NDPS Act That's the act we were talking about through the course of this episode, and the construction of a reservoir leading to the flooding of a coal mine. This may be a question that's easier for the lawyers out there, but we thought we'll start with an easy one. Please write in with your answers to justify@vidhilegalpolicy.in, and all right answers stand a chance to win a very exciting gift. Thank you for tuning in today. As with every episode in the last season, we end this one with a song. And if it's going to be about drugs in Punjab, it's really got to be about Udta Punjab. So thank you for tuning in. Adjourned.
पेट्रोल चल सुटिए अंदर दा कुत्ता अज कड़िए अग दुनिया पेट्रोल चल सुटिए पाउडर की लाइन का रखेगा कौन हिसाब हाँ उड़ता पंजाब हाँ उड़ता पंजाब.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, follow us on Twitter @Vidhi_India for regular updates. We are on SoundCloud and Spotify as Vidhi Center for Legal Policies podcast. You can also listen to us on Google Podcasts or iTunes. Email us at justify@vidhilegalpolicy.in to share your comments and feedback on this episode.